Welcome, friends. I'm Leif Winar, the faculty director of the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society, and it's my distinct honor to welcome you to the 20th anniversary of the Arrow Lecture in Ethics and Leadership. The Arrow Lecture is named in honor of our much-loved and much-missed colleague, Kenneth Arrow, one of the titans of 20th century economics, and one whose work remained true to Adam Smith's ideal that economics is a moral science. Ken was the youngest ever recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics when he won it in 1972 for his contributions to general equilibrium theory. If the rules had allowed it, he might have won another Nobel for his work on uncertainty and risk. And if the rules had allowed it, he might have even won another Nobel for his famous impossibility theorem. And about the impossibility theorem, I might mention that tonight's Arrow lecturer edited a volume on it with another of our previous Arrow lecturers, Amartya Sen. Perhaps most remarkably of all about Ken Arrow, 5 of Ken's students went on to win the Nobel Prize, and I'm delighted to say that one of the 5 is our 20th anniversary Arrow lecturer tonight, Professor Eric Maskin. I mentioned to one of my colleagues a year ago that Professor Maskin had graciously accepted the invitation to speak to us tonight, and my colleague got a slightly odd look in his eyes, said that he had taken a class with Maskin back at Harvard in the day, and that Maskin was an extraordinary intellect and teacher. If I mention that the colleague of mine was not only himself a John Bates Clark Medal winner in economics, but is also now the president of Stanford, you might get some sense of how delighted we are to welcome Professor Maskin to campus tonight. Eric Maskin is Adams University professor at Harvard, where he is also a professor in economics and mathematics. All 3 of Professor Maskin's degrees are in mathematics from Harvard, and he has been at his alma mater for almost the entirety of his distinguished careers, with only a few visits to Cambridge, England, and to MIT, and to the Institute for Advanced Study. I have to confess that I spent most of a day the other day with Professor Maskin's CV, and it's really one of those texts that you want to sit down on a comfortable chair and enjoy. In it, you'll see everywhere evidence of a life of intellectual achievement and even adventure. You won't be surprised to hear that the CV lists over 150 scholarly papers across a huge range of topics, as well as major publications and public-facing outlets like the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, New York Review of Books. But if you look closely, amidst all the major awards and fellowships and memberships in national academies, you'll see that Professor Maskin has also, for example, consulted with NASA on the economics of low Earth orbit, and has long been a correspondent for the Committee on Human Rights of the National Academies of Science, as well as serving on the advisory board for the International Peace Foundation. Professor Maskin has also given so many named lectures that you can almost tell the history of the 20th century with the names. For example, he's given lectures named for Winston Churchill, Alfred Marshall, Max Weber, Joseph Schumpeter, John Nash, Albert Hirschman, Jean Monnet, Amartya Sen, and 2 different lectures in honor of Vilfredo Pareto. And perhaps I can also mention, as far as I can tell, this is the 4th lecture in the past 27 years that Professor Maskin has given in honor of Ken Arrow in one way or another. So rest assured, he's gotten a lot of practice for tonight. Then there are the parts of Professor Maskin's CV that read like the biography of an extremely erudite world traveler. Just to give you some sense, across 17 countries, Professor Maskin holds 19 honorary doctorates and 20 honorary professorships. He's gotten medals of honor not only from the city of Marseille and the city of Toulouse, but also the Congress of Peru. He was awarded the Great Wall Friendship Award in Beijing, and also the James Joyce Award by the Literary and Historical Society at Trinity College Dublin. Along with all of his other prizes are two which might have been the hardest of all to win, which are his two teaching awards at Harvard, where, of course, everyone wants to be the best at everything. Modestly mixed in with Professor Maskin's other awards is an entry for the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics in 2007, which he shared for helping to lay the foundations of mechanism design theory. In his Nobel acceptance speech, Professor Maskin describes mechanism design theory in this way: we first identify what goals we want to achieve, and then we work backwards and ask what mechanisms could be designed to achieve those goals. Designing better mechanisms for our country is, of course, of the utmost urgency today, and so it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Eric Maskin and his Arrow lecture on how to depolarize American politics.
Well, thank you, Leif, for a lovely introduction. And thanks to the Humanities Center for inviting me here. It's always nice to come back to Stanford, where I have many friends. I see quite a number of them in the audience. But it's especially nice to come back for an event in honor of Ken Arrow, who was my teacher, after all, and literally changed my life. And let me explain how he did that. Ken actually, as you all know, spent most of his career at Stanford, but there was a narrow 10-year band where he was at Harvard, and I was lucky enough to be an undergraduate there just at the right time. I was a math major. I had no inkling of what economics was about. I didn't plan to take any economics classes. And I was more or less planning to go on to graduate school in math, maybe do number theory, which I liked a lot. But at some point, it was suggested to me that I take a graduate course on information economics by a certain Professor Arrow, who I'd never heard of. But on a whim, I decided I'd take the course. It turned out to be a hodgepodge of some of the cutting-edge topics that Ken was thinking about then. Mechanism design was one of them, asymmetric information, communication in organizations. Now, I can't say that Ken, despite his interest in organizations, was the most organized teacher. His lectures sounded a bit improvisational because they were improvised. He apparently decided on some occasions what he was going to talk about on his way over to the classroom. There was one occasion where he actually prepared a lecture in advance because it was on a pretty technical issue, proving a theorem, and he had written out notes. Unfortunately, he forgot the notes. So he recreated the proof before our eyes on the blackboard, which was probably a much more educational way of seeing the proof anyway. Despite my lack of knowledge in economics, and despite the somewhat chaotic nature of that course, I was completely hooked. And largely on the basis of that course, I changed directions, and I did a Ph.D. with Ken Arrow as my supervisor. It was the degree was nominally applied math, but it was really Ken Arrow economics. Now, one thing that we students in the class quickly learned about Ken was his extraordinary breadth of knowledge. which went way beyond economics. He'd be talking about adverse selection, and then some quotation from Maimonides would occur to him, or an analogy from thermodynamics. In fact, we soon discovered that no matter what the subject, he knew more about it than we did. And there was a story at Harvard that a group of junior faculty concocted a plan in which they could finally outshine Ken knowledge-wise. So they picked the most arcane topic they could think of, the breeding habits of gray whales, and they read up on this rather obscure subject. So on the appointed day, they all gathered in the coffee room and waited for Ken to come in, which he always did. And when Ken came in, they started talking about gray whales, and in particular about a rather elaborate theory due to a marine biologist named Turner about how whales find their way back to the same breeding spot year after year, despite being hundreds of miles away. And for once, Ken was silent. They had him at last. And so as a sort of victory lap, they continued to talk about Turner. But Ken was looking more and more perplexed. And finally, he couldn't hold back, and he blurted out, "But I thought Turner's theory was completely decimated by Spencer, who showed that the homing mechanism proposed couldn't possibly work." As you will see from my talk this evening, Ken's work, in particular his famous impossibility theorem, bears very directly on what I have to say. And I think that this is testament to just how central Ken's thinking was. The impossibility theorem was published 75 years ago, but it remains relevant, maybe too relevant, still today. So let me get to the talk. I think we can probably all agree that American politics is plagued by polarization. And in my view, this polarization is probably the greatest single threat to political stability in our country. What I'd like to argue, though, is that there is cause for hope, because the voting system itself, the American voting system, could be improved in a way that will counteract polarization. And that's what I want to explain this evening. So let's start with a particular example. Let's go back to the US Senate race in Ohio in 2022. I'm going to focus on this example, but I could give many, many others. Now, what happened in 2022? Well, Rob Portman, who had been quite a popular long-time incumbent, a traditional Republican, a non-Trumpist Republican, decided to retire rather than running in the Republican primary. Now, one question is, what would have happened had he stayed in and actually run in the primary? Well, there were a number of Trump-backed candidates, in particular J.D. Vance, who were planning to run. Vance did run in the primary and got the nomination. Vance went on to defeat Tim Ryan, the Democratic nominee, quite easily. Why did Portman retire? After all, he had been so popular. And he was a reasonably moderate alternative to a Trump-like figure like Vance. Of course, we don't know for sure because he wouldn't be willing to discuss these things publicly, but there's good reason to conjecture that he knew that he was likely to lose to a Trump-backed candidate because the Republican Party in Ohio had moved decidedly to the right. Even though the state itself was still maybe only slightly right of center, the Republican Party was very much to the right, and it would have been humiliating to lose in a primary after serving in the Senate for so long. Now, once the general election came along, Portman was urged to run as an independent. There was a precedent for traditional Republicans or moderate Republicans running as independents in the general election. This is what Lisa Murkowski of Alaska had done. She failed to get her party's nomination in 2010, but she ran anyway as an independent, actually as a write-in candidate in the general election, and she remarkably won. She didn't win by much, but she did win. And so Portman was urged to do the same thing. And this would have made some sense ideologically because there was a very considerable gap between Vance and Ryan, and Portman would have helped fill that gap. He would have provided a centrist alternative. Just to give you an example of how centrist Ohio was, at least until this past election, the other Senate seat had been held for years by a Democrat, Sherrod Brown. Brown lost in 2024, but just about every Democrat lost in 2024, so that wasn't a surprising outcome. But then the question arises, could Portman have won, as Lisa Murkowski did, as an independent? And the answer to that is almost certainly not. Because, well, for reasons I will come to, this may seem strange on the face of it, because if there had been a head-to-head contest between Portman and Vance, well, there's good reason to think that Portman would have won, because he would have had all the Democrats and he would have had the moderate Republicans on his side. And if it had been a head-to-head contest, Portman versus Ryan, again, we would expect Portman to prevail because most voters in Ohio are Republicans. They would presumably go for Portman, and he should have easily defeated Ryan. The strange thing is that if all three ran, Portman would lose. Now, why is that? That happens because of our peculiar voting system. It's called, and I would argue, defective voting system. It's called plurality rule, or in Britain, first past the post. It's very simple. You're all familiar with it. Each voter votes for one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins, even if that's short of a majority. And it often is short of a majority. It almost surely would have been short of a majority in a three-way Senate race. Here is an educated guess about what voters' preferences might have looked like had Portman run in the general election in 2022. So this first group are the Democrats, the Ryan supporters. And if they had the opportunity of ranking candidates, they would put Ryan first, of course, but they would put Portman second, because Portman, after all, is closer to them ideologically than Vance. On the other ends, the Vance supporters will rank Vance first, but probably Portman second, because, again, Portman would be better than the ideological opposite, Ryan. In between, the Portman supporters could go either way as far as who their second choice is, either Ryan or Vance. But notice that the Portman supporters are smaller in number than the Ryan or Vance supporters. If we look at this table, we see that in a two-person race, Portman beats Vance, because these voters prefer Portman to Vance, these voters prefer Portman to Vance, and so do these. These are the only ones who don't. So Portman wins 54 to 46. And similarly, Portman beats Ryan. Everybody but these voters ranks Portman above Ryan, so that adds up to 60%. But remember, we're not comparing candidates pairwise when we use plurality rule. It's whoever gets the most votes when voters are just voting for one candidate. And that means that Vance is the winner, because 46 is bigger than 40, and it's also bigger than 14, 3 plus 11. So the problem is that the Ryan voters can't express the fact that they prefer Portman to Vance, and the Vance voters can't express the fact that they prefer Portman to Ryan. And so Portman gets shut out. So I would argue that a potential cure for polarization is to elect more people in the middle, centrists and moderates, because the two main parties are so far apart that compromise at this point is almost impossible. As we can see from the Ohio example, we can't elect third-party centrists under our current voting system. Portman would come a distant third, even though there's a sense in which he really is the most popular candidate. So what can we do? I would say a first step is to allow voters to express themselves more fully, allow voters to rank candidates. Probably many of you have heard of ranked choice voting, which is actually something that I support and would definitely be an improvement over plurality rule. But I'm not going to push for ranked choice voting tonight. I'm going to, because it turns out that there's an even better system, a system even better at counteracting polarization, and that's Condorcet voting, after the Marquis de Condorcet, a late 18th century French political thinker. This sometimes goes under the name true majority rule, and you will see the sense in which it really is majority rule. Under Condorcet voting, voters rank the candidates just as in ranked choice voting. They don't have to rank them all, but they can rank as many as they want. And then the winner is simply the candidate who, according to the rankings, would beat each other candidate in a head-to-head contest. And in our example, that's Portman. Because as I already noted, if these are the rankings, we don't know for sure that these were the rankings in Ohio, but there's good reason to believe that they looked a lot like this. According to these rankings, Portman beats Ryan head-to-head, and Portman also beats Vance head-to-head. Portman is the true majority winner. There are many other possible voting systems. Ranked choice voting, which is now used in over 50 cities around the country and in 2 states, the state of Maine and the state of Alaska, for most of their elections. Ranked choice voting is a nice alternative. In ranked choice voting sounds pretty similar to Condorcet voting. Again, voters rank candidates. But now instead of electing the candidate who beats the others head-to-head, we look first to see whether there's some candidate who is ranked first by a majority of voters. If there is such a candidate, she wins outright. In this example, there's no such candidate. So if there's no such candidate, we then drop the candidate with the fewest first-place votes, which in this example is Portman, right? Portman only has 14% of first-place votes. So Portman gets dropped, and then it becomes a contest between Ryan and Vance, which Vance wins because 46% plus 11% of voters prefer Vance to Ryan, and that's a majority. So ranked choice voting in this example leads to quite a different outcome from Condorcet voting. It leads to Vance winning, and that's an illustration of the fact that ranked choice voting is not an adequate counterforce to polarization. We cannot elect centrist candidates because centrist candidates will never get enough first-place votes to pass the first round. Ken Arrow would not be impressed by these practical considerations, such as the one I was just suggesting, that ranked choice voting doesn't allow for enough centrists to be elected. He would argue that in order to really compare different voting systems, we have to go back to basics and ask what are the underlying principles that any good voting system should satisfy. And then once we've laid those principles out, then we can investigate which voting systems actually satisfy those principles. So what are the principles that voting theorists like me, but more generally people who have thought about these matters would suggest are almost essential? The first is a very simple idea, which is that if everybody in the electorate prefers candidate A to candidate B, then we shouldn't elect B. It would be perverse to elect B if everybody agrees that A is better. This is called the consensus principle. Economists would call it the Pareto principle for reasons I won't get into. So that I think we can take as given. Another basic principle is the idea that we should treat all voters equally. We shouldn't count some voters more heavily than others. A voting theorist would call this the principle of anonymity because it says that voters' identities don't matter, only their votes matter. And again, I think it's very hard to quarrel with that in a political election. Third principle says that just as we want to treat all voters equally, we want to treat all candidates equally. That is, the rules of the election system should be neutral when it comes to the candidates. For example, we don't want to give special privileges to the incumbent, and this is called the neutrality axiom. Well, these three principles seem so obvious and natural that it's very hard to think of a voting system that violates any of them. And in particular, Condorcet voting and ranked choice voting satisfy all three, as does, for that matter, plurality rule. I was criticizing plurality rule, but it does satisfy the three properties that I've talked about. But the next principle does serve to distinguish among the voting rules, the voting systems that I've been talking about. We might call this the no spoilers principle. Arrow called it independence of irrelevant alternatives or irrelevant candidates. But basically what it says is that if we hold an election involving candidates A, B, and C, and A wins, then if we hold the same election but only A and B are running, that is, C is no longer running, it should not be the case that B wins. Because if B won when C was not running, C would in effect be acting as a spoiler if A won when C was in the race. So a candidate like C, who is not going to win anyway, should not have the power to affect which of A and B wins. Let's call that the no spoilers principle. Well, Condorcet voting satisfies the no spoilers criterion by definition, because Condorcet voting only looks at two candidates at a time. Which of A and B wins is determined in a head-to-head contest. It doesn't matter what voters think of C. C is not going to affect the outcome of the contest between A and B. But ranked choice voting violates no spoilers. To see that, well, I just took you through what happens in an election where Ryan, Portman, and Vance are all running. Vance wins, according to ranked choice voting. But if Ryan doesn't run, now Portman wins. Because if Ryan is out of the race, then these voters rank Portman first. And so the support for Portman is 40 plus 3 plus 11. That's a majority. So ranked choice voting violates the no spoilers criterion. And now it seems that Condorcet voting has pulled ahead of ranked choice voting in the comparison. Now it turns out that it's a bit more complicated, and this is not the final word on axioms. In fact, Condorcet himself noted that an important principle for a good voting rule is that it be decisive, that is, that it lead to a clear-cut winner. And although Condorcet was a proponent of majority rule, true majority rule, Condorcet voting, he knew that it does not always produce a winner. Here is Condorcet's famous example. Once again, we'll call the candidates Ryan, Portman, and Vance, but I've changed the numbers. So in the group on the left, 34% of voters have the ranking Ryan, Portman, Vance, and so on for the other two groups. So note that Portman cannot be the winner in this example because Ryan beats Portman by a majority. These voters prefer Ryan to Portman. These voters prefer Ryan to Portman, and that's 67%. But Ryan can't be the majority winner because Vance beats Ryan. These voters prefer Vance to Ryan. These voters prefer Vance to Ryan, and that's 66%. But Vance can't be the majority winner because Portman beats Vance. these voters prefer Portman Advance, and these do too. So we go round and round in circles. There is no majority winner. This is what is now called the Condorcet paradox, an important observation about majority voting. Now, a natural question to ask is, we have 5 principles: consensus, anonymity, neutrality, no spoilers, decisiveness. We see that majority rule doesn't satisfy all of them. It violates decisiveness. We see that ranked choice voting doesn't satisfy all of them. It violates no spoilers. What about finding some voting system that satisfies all 5? That's the impossibility theorem. There is no voting system that satisfies all 5. And that's why Arrow's theorem landed with such force. These all seem like very natural conditions, very desirable conditions. We can't satisfy them all. However, I'd like to suggest that there's an important sense in which the Arrow theorem really is too negative, because it insists that these principles hold regardless of what voters' preferences turn out to be. And at least in political elections, like Ohio, voters' preferences are not arbitrary. They follow a definite structure. And in particular, it's very unlikely there are going to be a lot of voters who put Vance first and Ryan second. There might be some. There'll always be some. But they're not going to. It's not going to be a third of voters with this ranking. And so, yes, this is a theoretical possibility, but it's a very unlikely possibility. And perhaps we shouldn't worry about it. In fact, to follow up Arrow, you can show that for realistic preferences, Condorcet voting satisfies all 5 principles. In fact, if we add another very natural principle, which is sometimes called positive responsiveness, that's just the idea that if voters' preferences change in favor of candidate A, more people rank A above B than they previously did. That should not increase the chance that B wins rather than A. That would be very perverse. If we add positive responsiveness to the other 5 axioms, Condorcet voting is the only voting system that satisfies all 5 principles for realistic preferences that we would expect occur in actual political elections. And so that is the formal sense in which the Arrow approach to analyzing voting rules ends up singling out Condorcet voting as the right one. Now, as I was suggesting, there are other reasons why we might like the idea of Condorcet voting. In particular, it's very good at depolarizing our electorate because it favors candidates in the middle. In fact, there's another famous theorem due to Duncan Black, which shows that when voters' preferences are realistic, majority rule, Condorcet voting, elects the candidate who is the favorite of the median voter, the voter in the exact middle of the ideological spectrum. And that's the sense in which Condorcet voting really does promote compromise, because the median voter is the one most likely to be able to look to his left and look to his right and see some merits in both directions. Now, I've been talking theoretically, but you might ask, well, how practical is Condorcet voting? That is, could we expect it to actually be adopted? And there, I think, the answer actually is yes. And here I want to point to one of the features of the American voting system which is actually good. I've been concentrating on its flaws, but one virtue of our country is that each state can decide for itself what election system to use. And more than that, many states allow the question of which election system to use to be decided by ballot initiatives. So I mentioned before that the state of Maine and the state of Alaska went over to ranked choice voting, very much an improvement. That was not done through their state legislatures. In fact, the Maine legislature tried to get rid of ranked choice voting. Voters came back and voted for it again. There was a second referendum on ranked choice voting in Alaska in the last election. Again, the voters voted in favor. Well, you know, once a state has gone to ranked choice voting, it's a small additional step to go to Condorcet voting. The big step is to convince voters, and this has to be done through education. It's one reason why I like giving talks like this. I see them as spreading the word. Voters have to be convinced first that ranking candidates really does add a lot to their power as voters, and also it adds a lot to the quality of the outcome of the election. But once voters are ranking anyway, there's no reason why we can't make that final step and move to Condorcet voting. I'm actually involved with a number of voting advocacy groups in this country. Fair Vote, which is a group in Washington. There's another group called Rank the Votes. And one thing I'm working on now is persuading them to try out Condorcet voting, probably not at the state level at first, but in one of the cities where they're already using ranked choice voting as a test case. We're not going to go over to a new voting system unless it's been tested. Let's try it out at the local level. I suspect that they will be pleased with the outcome because, as I've argued, there are good theoretical reasons behind Condorcet voting. And once Condorcet voting has been tried out at the local level, then we move on to the state level. So Maine and Alaska have adopted ranked choice voting. We're hoping that a few other states might do so as well. Ranked choice voting was on the ballot in a number of other states last fall, but that was an inopportune time for a reform like that. So we didn't make progress in 2024, but let's see what happens in 2026 and beyond. And I'm an incrementalist when it comes to voting reform. We don't have to move straight to the optimum. One step at a time, I think, is the right way to go. So, yes, polarization is a major threat to political stability in this country, but I think there's reason for at least some cautious optimism that we can do something about that polarization. Thank you very much. Hi, Larry.
Okay, hi, Eric. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So I have a lot of comments and questions, but I'll just raise two if I can.
Yeah.
The first is, I really think it's important to get the Alaska system over the Maine system, because if you don't have a blanket primary, Rob Portman's not going to be on the ballot in November. He's going to lose a Republican primary unless he runs as an independent from the start, which most of them won't want to do. The second thing is, I think from my previous interaction with you that there may be an easier back door to Condorcet voting. And I wonder if you could maybe say a little bit about this.
Yeah.
As I understood what you were saying in a previous conversation, the way ranked choice voting works now is you eliminate the candidate. If no one gets a majority, you eliminate the candidate who has the lowest number of first preference votes. If you start from the bottom and work up, or have, you know, a kind of competitive contest between the two lowest finishers, you'll wind up, as I understood from what you were saying, with a similar or exact result. And frankly, most voters won't know the difference.
Yeah, that's right. So to your first observation, one important difference between Maine and Alaska is that Alaska has eliminated party primaries. So there's an open primary to which the 4 top finishers go to the general election. It's similar to California, but California has only 2 candidates going on to the general election, which is not enough. If you want to break the grip that the 2 major parties have on general elections, you have to allow for more than 2 candidates. Alaska has done a nice job of that. Maine still has party primaries, which make it more difficult for independents. Not impossible, but more difficult. So I agree with that. And then we come to the question of how do we introduce Condorcet voting in a way that seems almost like ranked choice voting? It turns out that there are several ways of modifying ordinary ranked choice voting very slightly so that the Condorcet winner, if there is a winner, will get elected. And as Larry said, instead of dropping the candidates with the fewest first place votes, look at the 2 candidates with the lowest votes and have a runoff between them. Now, if there's a Condorcet winner, the outcome of that runoff cannot eliminate that Condorcet winner because, by definition, the winner of that runoff is beating the other candidate by a majority. Now repeat this process. Keep eliminating candidates according to an instant runoff between the 2 lowest vote getters, and ultimately, because you're never eliminating the Condorcet winner, you will elect the Condorcet winner in the end. Very small change to ranked choice voting standard rules, but it can produce a much better outcome. In Ohio, it would elect Portman, not Vance. Thank you. There actually are there are other methods. There are other methods that can be used too. In fact, one virtue of Condorcet voting, which I didn't get into this evening, is that unlike ranked choice voting, and certainly in contrast to plurality rule, it can be made invulnerable to strategic voting. Strategic voting is the phenomenon where you prefer candidate A to B, but you vote for B instead because B is more likely to stop C, who you despise. Now, strategic voting makes a voting system a mess because for strategic, if voters are worried that their favorite candidate isn't going to win and so are tempted to vote strategically, they really have to know a lot about how other voters are going to behave in order to choose the optimum strategy. So it's much better to have a system in which strategic voting doesn't play any role. Condorcet voting can be conducted, I'm not going to get into it tonight, but it can be conducted in a way which eliminates the incentive to vote strategically.
So that, I was going to ask about strategic voting, and I was really going to I wanted to push back a little on the optimism about mechanism design, just in the sense that many countries are experiencing polarization with very, very different voting systems, and you might worry that there's other things going on, and if the population is that polarized and there's some underlying things that just tinkering with the mechanisms might not be enough if you don't change people's sense of what voting is about, what they're trying to do in expressing their vote, what their commitments are. That they're not motivated to be spoilers, that they're not motivated to just take the other person down. So this is just like, how much can mechanism do on its own without really addressing some of the underlying issues that are happening in many democracies right now?
Well, you are certainly right that there are many forces at work creating polarization. But I think skeptics perhaps underestimate the power of a voting system. And perhaps Condorcet voting is not going to cure polarization altogether, but it's a pretty powerful weapon. The voting system itself is the central institution in which through which the voters can express themselves. And I hope the Ohio example was convincing that it can lead and will lead to very different outcomes than the voting systems that we are used to. Yes, there's polarization around the world, but unfortunately, Condorcet voting is not used around the world. Perhaps if it were, things would be different. I should say that this is not the only country where voting reform is underway. That shouldn't be surprising. I have colleagues in France, for example, who are interested in reforming their system. Their presidential system is a runoff system in which if no one gets a majority in the first round, there's a runoff of the top two vote getters in the second round. That's a little better than plurality rule, a little better, but it can lead to some very perverse outcomes and has led to very perverse outcomes in the past. My friends would like to see something like Condorcet voting used in France as well.
Hello, thank you for this talk. I have a few questions, but I think I'll ask the most practical one that's on my mind. So you mentioned at the example of Alaska and Maine that people have voted this in again after the legislative or the local governments have tried to take it off.
Right.
So what do you think is the likelihood or what needs to happen for more states in the US to adopt this and maybe even eventually lead to a change at the federal level?
I think the most important ingredient in getting, say, Condorcet voting or even ranked choice voting adopted is education. If a voter, if you explain to the typical voter what the problem with plurality rule is, how ranked choice voting or Condorcet voting is going to solve that problem, they get it. I've given many public talks on this subject with people in the audience who are not especially politically minded. They hadn't thought about these things before. but they see it. And so the key, I think, is reaching enough voters by explaining to them the defects in the current system and how the new system will solve the problem. If you do that, that's what happened in Maine, you get change. Now, not all states, unfortunately, allow for ballot initiatives. I think there are 28, is that right, Larry? Something like 28. It's less than 28.
It's around half.
Okay. So we can't do this everywhere. I don't think it's necessary to do it everywhere by ballot initiative because there's bound to be a snowball effect. If you get 5 or 6 or 7 states to make the change and the other states see that actually this is leading to better outcomes, you can get support from legislatures for it as well. So the key is to spread the word and to educate.
Thank you very much for today. I would like to go back to the 2016 presidential primary and election
Right.
and look at 3 candidates. And in the last 6 weeks before the California primary, which was in the last wave, June 5th, all the national polls had Bernie Sanders beating Hillary Clinton in the primary and had Bernie beating the other guy who won in the general, which killed me, having been a Bernie supporter.
Yeah.
It sounds to me as if, let's pretend the polls also represented the way people voted if all 3 candidates had been there. That says to me, do you agree that Condorcet would have had Bernie win? We wouldn't be in such a mess. And does Condorcet ask for only 1 vote 1 time, the way ranked choice voting does? It's just a mathematical computer. Okay, good, thank you. So that we don't have the cost and the, okay. Would Bernie have won?
Well, let me put it a little bit different. I don't know whether Bernie would have won, but Hillary Clinton would have won if they had been using ranked choice voting in the general election, because you'll recall that in the 3 critical battleground states that Trump won, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, actually had more votes than the difference between Clinton and Trump. And in a ranked choice voting setting, Stein would have been eliminated in one of the early rounds. It would have been a contest between Clinton and Trump, which Clinton, on the evidence, would have won. People who voted for Stein would certainly rank Clinton above Trump. So we don't even have to use Condorcet voting to get the right outcome in the 2016 election. Now I don't know about Bernie, but
I do, though.
Okay.
And you were shaking your head yes, that you vote 1 time.
You vote 1 time. Now some people like the idea of having a runoff, but you could do that too. You could do Condorcet voting in 2 stages. That is, if you start with 16 candidates, as the Republican primaries in 2016 did, you can whittle things down until, using Condorcet methods, until you have just 2 candidates left, and then you have another election a week or 2 later between the two finalists. That's perfectly consistent with the arguments for Condorcet.
Except it's very much more expensive.
Well, there's a trade-off. There's a trade-off, which we're not going to resolve on purely theoretical grounds. The advantage of having a runoff is that voters get to think really hard about the two finalists. There's some advantage to that, particularly if you've got a very large field of 16 or so. Very difficult for any voter to think about all 16 candidates. But the disadvantage, of course, is that holding 2 elections rather than 1 is more expensive.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
One objection I can think of to Condorcet voting is that you might get a winner who has a very small base and is just kind of a satisficer that everyone is okay with, but there isn't really a base and voters might not have full information. Obviously, in this case, like, we would think it's acceptable for Portman to be reelected because voters kind of know who he is, but we can very easily imagine that that third candidate is instead just like Adam Sandler or like Larry David, and voters are like, sure, I'll take that over the guy I hate, but they don't really think he's going to win. So is there some inherent value in accepting a degree of polarization in order to have a more kind of ideologically coherent candidate with maybe a transformative vision rather than one who's just moderate?
So you raise a good point that it's conceivable that a candidate might slip through as a Condorcet winner, even though they're not really a moderating or centrist alternative to the major party candidates. But I think the right response to that is that Condorcet voting itself creates incentives for serious third-party candidates to run. At the moment, as we saw, a candidate like Portman is never going to run in a general election because he knows he doesn't stand a chance. But if we change the rules, if we move to a Condorcet system, that gives him and many other serious alternatives to Adam Sandler and Larry David a strong incentive to run. And once the serious candidates are running, then I don't think we have to worry so much anymore about Larry David and Adam Sandler.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. My name is Titi, and I'm really interested in teaching when I grow up. And you brought up education a few times during this talk and your Q&A. And we have a lot of really cool speakers like yourself in these spaces. And education is brought up a lot, but there doesn't tend to be like a vision for how to get this education to the people that need it most. So I'm wondering, do you kind of have thoughts on that? Is that something that's kind of outside the scope of your scholarship? Which is obviously like, totally fine and reasonable.
Well, I mean, I can talk about the sort of outreach that I and my voting reform friends have tried to do. So I give talks like this. This is a fairly long talk as my public talks go, and I hope there have been some advantages to hearing this at length. But I can also give someone a 5-minute version, which can be pretty effective too. But beyond that, you can reach people by writing op-eds. I've written a lot of op-eds on the subject. You can reach people by going to shopping malls. Actually, that turns out to be very effective. I haven't done that very much myself, but I have colleagues who love spending their weekends at shopping malls and saying, hey, have you heard about ranked choice voting?
Do that.
You have to do that because in order to get it on the ballots, you have to get enough signatures. It's usually several tens of thousands of signatures to get it on the ballot. And so how do you do that? Well, you actually go to the voters and where they're shopping. So yeah, there are plenty of opportunities to reach voters if you think about it.
That is so dope. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. My question has to do with the sort of what is ultimately normative justifying your commitment to courtesy voting. And I have a suspicion that there is another normative principle at work in your presentation, which is that we ought to prefer moderate candidates to non-moderate candidates as winners in democratic election. And that it was framed as there's a problem with polarization. What's the solution to polarization? Having more moderate candidates. How do we get there? Using this voting method. So is that really what's doing all of the justificatory work, which is this prior commitment to we must have moderates? Or is it the 5 principles that you articulated? And I worry that it's that principle of moderation that's influencing your vision of which 5 principles are morally correct.
So I think the answer, that's a good question. I think the answer is both approaches are useful. Because polarization is something that we think about these days and are worried about, I think it's natural to talk about how Condorcet voting is a potential cure for that. But I don't stake everything on that approach. I think the Arrow approach is 75 years later still a strong and persuasive approach to the normative question, what is the right voting system? On the issue of electing moderates, I would take a step back and say that it's not so much electing moderates that's the goal. Mm-hmm. It's electing candidates who command majority support. That's the goal. If you live in a democracy, you tend to believe that in choosing between A and B, the majority should rule. One very attractive feature of Condorcet voting is that you don't end up in a situation where A wins, but a majority prefer B. That itself, I think, is a compelling argument for Condorcet voting. It turns out to lead, through the arguments that Duncan Black made, to moderation, but that's a consequence, not an assumption.
Yeah, so if it ended up being that it yielded more non-moderate candidates, you'd be neutral with respect to which voting system.
There are some cases where a pretty radical candidate is going to command majority support. Think of FDR. FDR, in his time, was about the most radical president we ever had. He was enormously enhancing the power of the federal government. This was not moderate behavior, but he was also extremely popular. He commanded majority support. So that's a circumstance where there is a disconnect between what the majority want and moderation, and I think that's fine.
Yeah. Thank you.
So your example was about Ohio, and you sort of convinced us or told us that we don't need to worry about the impossibility theorem because, those preferences, the Condorcet paradox won't hold. But then later in the talk, and I buy it for national politics, but then later...
Just to interrupt you for a sec, we actually have an enormous amount of data from ranked choice voting elections. We can actually compute the Condorcet winner in those elections.
Yeah.
In every statewide election that has ever been held, there has always been a Condorcet winner.
Yes, and I was, saying I buy it at the kind of state and national level. You can tell me you have all the data for local, and I'll believe the data. But my understanding of the local politics literature is that local politics, first,
Right.
there are a lot of nonpartisan, and also
That's right.
it doesn't follow the national trends. So I
Right.
kind of have two questions. One is, what happens when there's, there has to be, particularly in a local election, what happens if there's not a Condorcet winner? What's your theory, from the theoretical side, what do you propose? And then I also have a logistical question, which is, you mentioned the right place to start is in local elections. And I guess it depends a little on what your backup plan is, whether, maybe, would it be worth considering getting it on the ballot for a statewide election if it's more likely to produce a Condorcet winner?
Okay, so we do have data from 50 cities, 50 plus cities, using ranked choice voting. We have the actual rankings. We can see whether there's a Condorcet winner. If I remember correctly, there is one instance where there was not a Condorcet winner out of thousands. But you're right, there has to be a backup plan for what do you do if there's no Condorcet winner. And for that, I'll go back to what Larry was saying before. You can take ranked choice voting and tweak it.
Yeah.
Instead of eliminating the candidate with the fewest first place votes, you have a runoff between the two lowest. That will give you a Condorcet winner if there is one, but it will also be decisive even if there's not a Condorcet winner. You will always get a well-defined winner. So that's a perfectly good backup plan, and there are others as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
All these erudite questions,
Yeah.
I can't help but ask but one very practical question.
Yeah.
The real challenge seems to be explaining this, and as you say, educating. If people knew it, they would go for it. And so I'm thinking of our fellow citizens out there in the shopping malls, trying to explain it to their fellow citizens. Could you use a sports analogy? I mean, there's a lot of Americans devoting a lot of neurons to sports. Like, the basketball playoff brackets come out in March, and there's a lot of people going to bet the mortgage payment on the bracket. So when we're out in the malls, could you, instead of doing Vance Portman and Ryan, could you do Ohio State, Michigan, and Notre Dame or something like that?
It's interesting that you should mention sports because ranked choice voting is actually used in some sports or something close to ranked choice voting. There are certain sports which require judging. It's not how fast you are, it's how well you perform in the eyes of a panel of judges. And ranked choice voting has been used for figure skating, for example, where you have judging. Interestingly, so Americans also like, they also pay attention to the Oscars. You might wonder, how is the best picture determined in Oscar voting? It's done by ranked choice voting. So there are lots of examples outside politics that we can turn to catch voters' attention.
Like Ken Arrow, wherever you go, our speaker has been there already. Let us thank Eric Maskin for his talk. Thank you so much.